All right. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled Engaging with Afghanistan to Prevent a Humanitarian Disaster. My name is Threat of Pariah. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. For years, billions of dollars were allocated to the war in Afghanistan. Though the desired results were never achieved, the money flowed uninterrupted. Most of it, of course, went towards the war and US contractors rather than the reconstruction of Afghanistan itself. In fact, Congress earmarked over $3 billion just to the Afghan military prior to its collapse in August. The question is, do we have a similar determination to help the Afghan people as millions face starvation this winter? The $474 million that the United States has pledged to distribute in Afghanistan thus far pales in comparison to what is needed to prevent mass famine. And of course, it pales to the trillions of dollars that the United States spent on the war itself. To make matters worse, most of Afghanistan's funds are now frozen by global powers attempting to keep cash away from the Taliban government. Beyond humanitarian reasons, the United States arguably has a strategic reason to prevent state collapse in Afghanistan, as that will destabilize the entire region and potentially drag the United States back into Afghanistan militarily. So what can and what should the United States do to help the Afghan people and prevent further destabilization? To address these important questions, we have an excellent panel with three prominent experts in this field. Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jan Egeland, is with us, as is International Crisis Group's Asia Program Director, Laurel Miller, and of course, Shahrzad Akbar, Chair of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. QI's own Adam Weinstein will be moderating the conversation. But before I hand it over to Adam, let me also mention that for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function in order to ask your questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, put your questions in the comment section, and Adam will try to get to those as well throughout the conversation. So with no further ado, over to you, Adam.
Thanks for that introduction, Trita. And I'm going to add to a little bit of the bios here for our panelists, because they really have been engaged on the most pressing issues in Afghanistan for a long time. And excuse me while I read from this paper, because I don't want to forget anything. For Shahrzad, in addition to serving as chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission since, I believe, 2019, she was previously deputy on the National Security Council for Peace and Civilian Protection in Afghanistan. And she has also worked as senior advisor to the Afghan President and High Development Councils from 2017 to 2018. And before that, she served as country director for Open Society Afghanistan. Laurel served from 2013 to mid-2017 as deputy and then acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department. She was senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, senior advisor to the US Special Envoy for the Balkans, and deputy to the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues. And she also served as director for the Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. Jan has a distinguished career in international work. Successive UN Secretary Generals have appointed him to take on some of the toughest challenges in the world, including Syria. From 2003 to 2006, he was UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. He was also among the initiators of the peace negotiations that led to the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1993. And in 2006, Time magazine named him 100 People Who Shape Our World. He also continues to travel to Afghanistan and recently met with the Taliban's Foreign Minister Mutaki. So he continues to travel and meet with senior Taliban figures in order to try to assist the people of Afghanistan. Shahrzad, I'm going to begin with you. You had to leave Afghanistan in August, which I imagine was incredibly hard for you. And it's the second time you've left Afghanistan. You had to leave as a teenager. And later on, you studied in the United States. And I think you became if I'm not mistaken, the first Afghan woman to do postgraduate studies at Oxford. And I'm hoping you can give an overview of both the economic and human rights situation that Afghans are facing right now.
Thank you, Adam. I'm so honored to be part of this panel and this really important conversation. Of course, both the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation in Afghanistan are dire, and of course, they are interconnected. The humanitarian situation, as Sarah Egeland and others have really eloquently spoken about it, has been, I think, unprecedented levels of poverty and hunger in the past 20 years at least. So Afghans who 3-4 months ago were in a position to support themselves and their families are now at the mercy of humanitarian aid. They have to wait for humanitarian aid. My own extended family and friends who are teachers or healthcare workers haven't received salaries for months, or have received one salary after several months, having put them and their families in difficult situations. And these are people who even tried to help others. As you know, Afghanistan for the longest time, for the past 20 years, had a big internal displacement issue, for instance, and always people opened their houses, even when they were desperate or poor, to other community members. But right now, almost no one is in a position to help someone else inside Afghanistan. People, even who have money, don't have access to the money that they have in the banks, or don't have regular access to the money that they have in the banks. The human rights situation as well is extremely worrying. We really don't know what legal framework is being upheld. In the meantime, we see extrajudicial killings. We see, unfortunately, instances of illegal detentions, torture in detention, especially in parts of Afghanistan where Taliban are holding, for instance, in Nangarhar, Taliban have held hundreds of people in detention. And it seems like torture is the main instrument being used under allegations of their cooperation with IS. There is no monitoring of places of detention. Women victims of domestic violence have access to no legal support. Additionally, of course, women, as half of the population of Afghanistan, have less rights than they have had in the past 20 years. And women in the government offices have been sent back home. Women who are the head of their households are unable to work anymore in a war-ravaged country where many families are headed by women, and girls don't have access to higher education and secondary education in parts of Afghanistan. So it's an extremely worrying situation.
Thanks for sharing what is a very dire situation. And of course, the economy was in dire straits the day before the Afghan government fell, and now we see inflation is increased, food scarcity has increased. And I want to bring in Jan, who I know has to leave at 45 after the hour, but who has most recently been in Afghanistan. And the descriptions I've heard from you is that Afghans are living on tea and dry bread. There's no liquidity. Your own staff cannot get money, and you're having trouble paying them. And it forces your own staff to go buy tents and supplies in Pakistan rather than Afghanistan in order to engage in some of the critical work. So could you expand a little bit on what the situation is, based on your most recent trip to Afghanistan?
Yeah, I was in Afghanistan and met with people in great need, women, men, girls, boys. I was in Iran only a week ago and met Afghan refugees there. And I think you really have to travel to the region to understand how deep the crisis is at the moment. So when I travel with my colleagues, female and male colleagues who are staying and delivering. I mean, we have 2,000 humanitarian workers on the ground. We did not go for the door in August. We stay there. We work there. We have education for boys and girls. We have programs. So we started a winterization campaign. But meeting these mothers then in these really, really miserable conditions in the camps around Kabul, to where people have fled for the last 20 years from fighting in Helmand and in Kandahar and in the north and in the west and the east. I mean, their message was pretty clear. I mean, I brought up, of course, to the women, how afraid are you now with the takeover? How is the situation for you? What about girls' education and all of the things that we discuss here? Their message was very clear. They said, we either get an economy back so at least our husbands have income, which there hasn't been for months, or there is an aid program resumed, which is very slow in getting off the ground for many of the reasons you said, or we freeze and starve to death these coming weeks and months. It's as simple as that, really. It's been now, it's 23 out of the 40 million people in Afghanistan are now estimated to stare hunger, in the face now, in states of hunger. They go hungry to bed every night now, because what happened when the NATO nations left in August was that they turned off the switch, which was really the economic lifeline to the Afghan people. 3 things have to happen. I just list them. We need to have financial transfers going. There isn't even a banking system, as you mentioned. There is no economy. The private sector is collapsing. Those people who survived on $1 a day have no casual labor, no income. There has to be a financial sector. It's not rocket science to reestablish that. It's unfreezing assets, for example. It's telling the banks they shouldn't be so afraid, etc. Secondly, we need to have the public sector up and going. I mean, it's the same teachers and doctors and nurses and water engineers and garbage collectors who were there before. They are there now. They were on the payroll of the World Bank and others then. Now they haven't gotten any salary since May, most of them, because the Ghani regime collapsed in the last 2 months. That has to be resumed with trust funds held by the UN, money unfrozen that is sitting for them in Washington, so that all of these people can be paid. And thirdly, we who are aid workers on the ground need to have here less pledges for support and real transfers of money so that we can resume our operations. But again, humanitarian work will only fix a piece of this. The 23 million need to have an economy, and that's not there at the moment. And we'll come back to the responsibility of the Taliban. I met with the bearded leaders, because they have an immense responsibility. They took power by weapon, but those nations who kept them, who really took upon themselves this military political project and left, they also have a lot of responsibility for the 40 million civilians they left behind.
Yeah, so I have a few follow-up questions. You mentioned the UN Trust Fund. I know that Shahrazad has talked about a UNDP Special Trust Fund as well. And yet we don't even see nations willing to engage in basic humanitarian aid that wouldn't come at a political cost. In fact, Laurel, I remember recently on Twitter, you pointed out that the UN Coordinated Humanitarian Response Plan is still at 63% funded. I mean, that I find that unacceptable. And I checked as of the 7th of November, which was the last time they published a report, it was still at 63% funded, let alone more expansive measures like unfreezing funds. And Jan, you had a quote that I think really hit home, which was that you wanted to remind NATO nations that the civilians that are inching towards starvation now are the same civilians that they claimed to support for the last 20 years. The people of Afghanistan have not changed. The only thing that's changed is the government. And I'm wondering, how willing do you think are the Taliban to work with the international community? We've seen that they've slowly opened some girls' schools, but yet many girls remain out of school. They've cooperated on some CT measures, yet they seem unwilling to cooperate on others. What is your sense of the Taliban's appreciation for the situation the country is in and how far they're willing to go with the United States or the international community?
All of the human rights abuse that Shahrazad mentioned is there, really. Much of it was also there before, by the way. And I mean, the mothers I met, for example, they said, the couple of things that are good is there is less fighting now, and number two, you don't meet corruption and the demand for bribery at any corner. And I mean, there was part of the public sector which was kleptocratic before, but of course I mean, they tell us. Mutaki, he's number 5 in the hierarchy. I think he's the foreign minister. I met with one of the Haqqanis, who, because he's our line minister, he's the minister for refugees and humanitarian work, and they were flanked by Taliban soldiers in military gear like you probably had on, Adam, that they took and found enormous quantities of, and American guns and whatnot. What they say is, yes, you can have now access all over the countries, all over the country, to all groups, all minorities, all religious communities, etc., as humanitarians. We will not interfere in your selection of people in need, your needs assessment, and so on. All of these are red lines for us. And your female staff can work alongside the male staff all over the country. And you can do girls' education. We need to negotiate the secondary and up. That sounds very nice, as it said, and perhaps they also mean it. But you have to negotiate this province by province, district by district. And it's not so easy to meet those guys there locally. My colleagues in the field who traveled all over to do these negotiations say that in now more than half of the 14 provinces where we are operational, they have the assurances of, for example, the right of female staff to work with full freedom of movement. Still lacking in some, basically. So what they say in Kabul doesn't necessarily play in Baghdad or in countryside outside of Kandahar. Not that it was that easy either before. I mean, a large part of the country was under Taliban rule. We worked in those areas. NRC is an organization that always worked where the needs are. So we had an office even in Sabul in the occupied territory, in the Taliban-controlled territories. We had schools in Taliban-controlled territories for boys and girls and so on. For many years, it varies a lot between the north, the south, the east, and the west.
So it's fair to say people are at the whim of the local Taliban commander, so to speak.
Yeah, their closest gun is often the most important.
I wanted to bring in the region for a moment because you mentioned that you had just been to Iran. And of course, Afghanistan is suffering because of sanctions and because of the lack of liquidity, but it's placed smack dab in the middle of a sanctioned region. And of course, Iran is one of the primary targets of US sanctions, but at the same time, it's absorbing thousands of Afghan refugees and also deporting thousands of Afghan refugees. So there's a real exchange of people there. What do you think the effect, if any, has been of US sanctions on Iran in terms of what the humanitarian situation is in Afghanistan? Is there an interrelatedness there?
I think there is. I mean, Iran has not taken thousands; they've taken millions of refugees. Or Afghan migrants. There are between 3.5 and 4 million Afghans now in Iran. 320,000 since the Taliban took over. So it's, of course, it's important for us Europeans to realize that the 4,000 migrants at the Polish-Belarus border that brought all of Europe up into some kind of hysteria about how dangerous this was. That's the accumulated number there is the same as comes across the border to Iran every single day, estimated between 4,000 and 5,000. Three now, soon 400,000 people. And they leave because they've lost hope for a better life. And the biggest driver is the economy, but it's also discrimination. There's a lot of Hazara, Shia, Tajik in those who come. So again, the sanctions regimes that was intended to fix the nuclear issue is having consequences on an economy that previously was able to employ most of these Afghan people. They were in refugee camps to a large degree in Pakistan, paid for by international West money from the West. In Iran, they were working. Now, of course, they're unemployed because the economy is going down all the time, and those who are first to have to be let loose, unemployed when there is an economic crisis, are the weakest groups. So yes, it has an effect. NRC couldn't transfer money for a full year after the Trump administration slammed the sanctions on Iran, because no bank dared touch any money going internationally to Iran. So we couldn't transfer NATO country aid money to Afghan refugees in Iran at the time when it was of big importance to not destabilize Afghanistan for the West because of the sanctions slammed by the same NATO countries.
So even where licenses exist possibly on humanitarian grounds, there's a chilling effect because people are just afraid to enter that web of complexity. Yes. And the US government doesn't communicate it very well.
No, it's counterproductive. That's why we have International Crisis Group, isn't it, to point to that kind of inconsistencies. I find again and again that there are policies that have unintended consequences, and the sanctions policies and the anti-terror policies have the unintended consequence that it's very hard actually to help the victims of terror, which are not in the West predominantly, they're in these countries, and we who are there on the ground are really having a hard time. We have money transfers cut to these kind of places every single day. We had our money held in Washington's DC had to change bank because of us working in Iran. It's crazy.
So, Laurel, you have a granular understanding of US policy in the region. I think the Biden administration finds himself in a tough position. They're worried about the optics of unfreezing funds, which would literally mean pallets of cash arriving at the Kabul airport and possibly being transferred to the Taliban. And yet we've heard, a variety of creative proposals put forward. Human Rights Watch had a report where, aside from talking about, broader OFAC licenses, they suggested we allow the central bank to engage in limited settlement transactions, accept remittances and aid, and perhaps even designate a private bank to handle bigger transactions. Other people have suggested perhaps there be an independent auditor and the funds being frozen in a piecemeal fashion. What are the options for the Biden administration, and what are the risks?
Thank you. I think the main risk of taking some of the steps that you've outlined, that Jan has outlined here, are political ones. That not only the United States, but other Western donors who have to be responsive to their voters, to lawmakers' concerns, are wary of taking steps that look like it could be supportive of a Taliban regime in Afghanistan, a regime that is engaging in not only the past behaviors of concern and fighting a war with the United States and NATO, but some of the ongoing human rights violations that Shahrazad outlined. The risk also, I think, is perceived to be that if you are providing support that either could be diverted by the Taliban or free up other resources for Taliban discretionary purposes, or otherwise reinforce the consolidation of power in Taliban hands, then what might you be doing in enabling them to once again provide safe harbor for terrorist groups? So there's a security dimension to the perceived risks of engagement with the Taliban. I think on the other hand, who benefits from a failed state in Afghanistan? Obviously, the Afghan people don't benefit from a failed state in Afghanistan. I am hard pressed to see how the United States and Western donor nations benefit from a failed state in Afghanistan, given that that would mean a shadow economy that would be entirely unaccountable, given that it would be certainly a blow to the credibility and the sort of a stain, I would say, on the honor of the United States and other donors, given the scale of the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan. We've seen the consequences of failed states around the world, and the consequences are not ones that are beneficial to international peace and security. Probably the only entity that would benefit from a failed state in Afghanistan is the Islamic State, which I would say that is obviously contrary to Western interests if the Islamic State is able to gain more ground in Afghanistan as a situation deteriorates there. It's I think what you could say is there is a real collision that has occurred between the longstanding Western message to the Taliban that if you take power by force instead of through negotiations in a manner that would involve sharing power, you will be an international pariah again, ruling in Afghanistan starved of resources. That's a longstanding message that the US and others have delivered to the Taliban when trying to encourage them to enter into negotiations. On the other hand, the US and Western donors have delivered a message repeatedly to the Afghan people that they would not abandon them, that they would not wash their hands of Afghanistan, as was done in the 1990s with the negative consequences that flowed from that decision. And I think what you're seeing and the struggle that policymakers are grappling with right now is that these two longstanding policy lines cannot be brought into alignment. It is not possible to stand by the Afghan people and to prevent the scale of harms that have been talked about here while isolating the government and trying and taking steps such as those that are already in place that normally are used to try to provoke the failure of a government, or theoretically to pressure it to take certain steps that you want them to take. But in this case, and we can talk about this more if you like, I think there's a really sharp limits to the degree of leverage that aid provides over Taliban policies and practices.
Yeah, you mentioned the Islamic State, and I think it's worth noting that today Reuters published that the UN envoy to Afghanistan now assesses that the Islamic State is present in all of Afghanistan's provinces. And I think you mentioned in your testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday that if Afghanistan becomes a failed state, which you've alluded to here, it could become a narco state even more than it already is, or it could become a state in which ISKP runs wild. You mentioned the fact that the threat of pariah status and the threat of cutting off aid was used as a negative inducement, so to speak, before the Taliban took over the country. But it strikes me that once the negative actor or the target of these threats takes power anyway, the leverage is lost. I mean, whatever leverage we had, it was in the threat, not so much in saying to the Taliban, well, we're going to sink the country with you in it. Do you think that's correct? And how much, leverage does the Biden administration have over a Taliban that's completely isolated versus one that it has some form of engagement with?
Well, to be clear, the use of that line, you'll be a pariah if you don't engage in a peace negotiation, didn't work. I mean, there wasn't a peace negotiation, or one started very late and too late, really, to have any prospect of success. So even when it was a threat, it was one that failed to induce the actions that were desired. I think we have to see very clearly that the Taliban is a resilient group. That doesn't mean they will hold together in the way they are now forever, and that they aren't vulnerable, that they don't have any vulnerabilities at all, but they resisted extraordinary military pressure by the most powerful militaries in the world for 20 years. If they could do that, I think they can resist the financial pressure that they are experiencing now. And I suspect that they are prepared to accept the impoverishment of Afghanistan if that's what it means for them to stay in power. Now, that doesn't mean that they are entirely impervious to the remonstrances of the international community. I don't think they would be putting even the slightly more positive face on their policies that they are. And I'm not saying I take these things at face value, their promises, but I don't think they would even be putting forward that more relatively more positive seeming narrative and promises about, we will eventually allow girls to go to school and such, whether they mean it or not, if they didn't feel that there was some benefit to be gained for them by promoting that kind of narrative. Now, that doesn't give me great hope that there is more than a marginal degree of leverage that aid and international acceptance could provide. But I do think that if you're comparing options, as you have to do if you're a policymaker, isolation has zero prospect of producing leverage. Engagement has a slight prospect of producing leverage and of getting slight improvements in Taliban policies and practices. Isolation has zero chance of preventing an economic collapse. Engagement has the potential to help the Afghan people, to prevent a lot of suffering. And so, that's what policymakers have to look at. If you can set aside, which is difficult for them to do, the political risks and benefits here. I look at the risk benefit calculation of isolation versus engagement, and I think you're not going to get anything out of an isolation strategy that is worth 1 million Afghan children dying in the next year.
And I know you've said that exact quote several times, and you keep hitting that point. And I can't help but reflect on the months leading up to the withdrawal, when I think the Biden administration, frankly, had cold feet about getting the special immigrant visa applicants out for a variety of reasons. One, it was logistically difficult. Two, they didn't want to appear as if they were undermining the Ghani administration. And three, I think there were domestic considerations about in terms of refugee policy, et cetera. And the Biden administration shied away from that problem, and it became a disaster that blew up in its face. And I can't help but think we might be seeing the same pattern unfold here. So what do you think the cost is politically? We know what the risks are of engaging and unfreezing part of the funds, or increasing aid, or issuing broader general licenses. But what are the risks of not doing any of that, of just dragging our feet and letting a humanitarian crisis unfold? I think Jan outlined those risks for the Afghan people pretty well. But what would be the risks for the international community in the United States if we were to just simply allow Afghanistan to descend into starvation and universal poverty?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of political risks, if that's what you mean, given that that is part of the way that senior decision makers look at it, I do think there is a real possibility that flexibility about aid provision will increase as the situation worsens on the ground and the picture looks worse and worse. The question is, if it's only in reaction, how much cost is there in terms of Afghan lives and well-being in the meantime, if you're doing this in a reactive way? The difficulty of the political calculation is, let's say that the Biden administration tomorrow decided to unfreeze the central bank assets. Unfreezing the central bank assets to inject liquidity into the Afghan financial system, the banking system, would literally mean sending pallets of dollar cash to Afghanistan. That's a horrible optic for an American government. I mean, there was enormous criticism of the Obama administration after the Iran nuclear deal for unfreezing some Iranian state assets and, being accused of shipping dollars to the regime in Tehran. It didn't really matter what the facts were. And it wouldn't really matter what the facts are in terms of Afghan state assets. The optic would, from a political perspective, be, the Biden administration gives billions of dollars to the Taliban regime. So that's a real political obstacle. Now, there are other things that can be done, and they've been alluded to here. And Adam, you mentioned that there are some ideas that the UN and the World Bank and others are looking at that I think are very pragmatic ideas to loosen up the constraints on aid, short of this most extreme measure of unfreezing the central bank assets. And I think there may be scope there over time for some flexibility. I hope it's sooner rather than later. But when you look at the risks from a political perspective, there's the immediate in your face tomorrow risk for an action that you take. And then there's the kind of gradual, it's out there risk. We don't know what it's really going to look like when the situation worsens, and what is that going to mean? And, the immediate risks often, unfortunately, take greater precedence. And it's just, that is unfortunately the way of politics.
I mean, it's a real tragedy because, of course, our legacy in Afghanistan over 40 years has been short-sighted goals and calculations to the detriment of long-term solutions. And I think it's nothing short of heartbreaking that millions of Afghans could starve to death simply because there may be a misleading headline in an American tabloid aimed at the Biden administration. Jan, I know you have to go in a few minutes, but I want to ask you if there's one thing that either the United States or the international community could do in the next month that you think is feasible, and one thing that they could do in the next 3 months that you think is feasible, what would be those two recommendations from you?
It would be, I mean, it's actually pretty simple, as we have talked about here now. If we don't want Afghan children to starve to death, while we talk about, for example, girls' education, it would be very important to keep girls alive until we realize girls' education for all. So number one, realize this is not for the Taliban. I agree with the slogan that is popping up all over, not a penny to the Taliban. I agree with that. It's a political military movement. They do not need money. They should not have money. To reach the Afghan population, again, you have to set up some system so that the banking system can function. At the moment, we have to use the Havala system. You may know it's a sort of a system in mostly Islamic countries where you transfer money through private moneylenders on each side of a border. That's very expensive, and there's much less control on that money than it would be if it went through the private banks. So unfreeze assets so that the banks can start working. Give the funding to the UN agencies, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, the international NGOs like NRC and many other good ones who are there. We are accountable for every penny to the donors. We work in difficult situations all over the world, and then do more of the trust funds that already have been working in Houthi-controlled Yemen, for the Palestinian police when we did the Oslo Accord in the old days, and so on. People have to come down from the fence, really, and act now. We don't have months. We have days. Is my strong feeling. And if not, everybody will give up. They will wander to the borders. They will and you will have you will potentially have a failed state, and it will be horrific for the civilian population. And I don't think that would either be good headlines for any administration. You left for the door. You left the civilians behind, and they perished.
Well, thank you for that stark warning, and I hope the powers that be in the world heed that warning and choose to come off from the fence and not turn a blind eye and hope that it will go away, because I do agree with you that those headlines will not be conducive for anyone. Shahrazad, I wanted to come back to you. You've really emphasized the way aid is delivered over conditionality. In fact, when it comes to humanitarian aid, you've essentially rejected the idea of conditionality, but instead focused on asking policymakers to really think seriously about the mechanisms through which the aid is delivered. And I think what Jan was speaking about adds to that as well. But I'm wondering if you could expand on what you mean by that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what should be at the heart of the matter is the fact that people should not starve, right? That's as basic as it is. And there are political considerations, as Laura also spoke about, but there have been already so many solutions put forward. I think what bugs me day and night is, why aren't people, including the Taliban, working 24/7 to actually realize these solutions? Or are people working 24/7? Are people in the US or people in Europe working 24/7 in World Bank and the UN to actually translate these solutions to action before millions of people starve? I mean, we don't have time. We are running out of time, and children don't have time. Afghan children don't have time. And in terms of delivery of humanitarian aid, I don't think, clearly, as Ruler also stated, the reasons for not delivering, even the reasons for not unfreezing of assets or not providing development aid is not necessarily human rights issues. It's more about reputations of these governments among their own people and the political implications for them. So I don't think humanitarian aid should be at all conditional. I think that if it's at 60%, which is what also I last checked was, that's shameful. Why is that the case? Why hasn't the pledge been met already? Why aren't we doing more to literally help people from starvation? Every time I have a meal, I feel guilty because millions of people in Afghanistan are starving, and I just feel like we are not doing enough about that. How is that okay? How is that acceptable at all? But also the way aid is being delivered is important. And I think this is where international organizations do have some power and leverage. So I was very impressed by NRC when part of the initial discussions that they had with Taliban, in fact, was that our female staff should be able to go to work. They should be able to operate. And I think this is very, very important. It's important for UN to say, look, we are here, we want to deliver, we want to stay, but that means we will have our female Afghan staff showing up to work and having the safety of movement. And that also means that in engaging with Taliban, you do have women engaging with Taliban. And in engaging with Taliban, you do bring up issues of minorities' access to aid, different groups' access to aid, and the fact that women have to have access to aid. So I think in terms of the conversations that we have with Taliban, what sometimes worries me is the fact that I see that sometimes issues of access become so important maybe for some organizations that they start playing by Taliban's playbook when it comes to human rights. And that's not okay. That's not acceptable, right? That's not something that we expect from international organizations that have to uphold human rights. you can't force Taliban to do that, but you should have the standards implemented yourself. And I think that's what a lot of Afghans are looking at. I mean, we saw an internal memo sent to some UNDP staff a while ago that talked about female staff working from home, female Afghan staff working from home. And it was outrageous to me. Even if there are safety concerns, they are probably for specific people, and there should be solutions found for these people, and those people can make that decision. But to have a different working arrangement based on gender, how is that different from what Taliban are proposing or imposing on the Afghan women? So I think that's another part of the conversation that's very, very important. I also want to add to what Laura said about aid as leverage in this illusion. I think it's an illusion. It's delusional to think that aid is necessarily leverage. And if by withholding aid we can make Taliban deliver on human rights. I mean, I think we need to really think, when we think about the human rights situation in Afghanistan, we really need to think creatively, and we need to think about to what extent we can open up space in Afghanistan, to what extent we can help the civil society that remains there, media that remains there, to what extent we can have domestic pressure. The province that I come from in Afghanistan, all girls go to high school, and girls also go to teacher training institute. It's not because Taliban want them to, it's because the communities negotiated and pressured Taliban to actually make that happen. So how can we also continue to support Afghan civil society, Afghan community elders, and Afghans who are standing up for human rights themselves inside the country to have that kind of engagement and dialogue, so it's not just external pressure.
And on your point about forcing the Taliban to engage with women and not having international organizations play by their rules, I did notice that when Jan met with their foreign minister, he did have a woman as part of his delegation, and I think that's important. Unfortunately, a lot of diplomatic missions and some international organizations have chosen to meet the Taliban without any women present. From what I can see, the Taliban are desperate enough that they will meet with delegations if a woman is present, especially a foreign woman, and even perhaps in some cases a local woman. And I think there's a normative value to forcing the Taliban to sit down at the table with women. It would be better if they were willing to sit down with their own fellow Afghan women, but anything is better than nothing. And I think it's the beginning of change when international organizations refuse to play by those rules. If the Taliban want the legitimacy of having a photo op with a reputable organization, well, there should be a woman included in that photo. Laurel, I wanted to come back to you for a moment, because it seems to me that we've really had basically the pendulum has swung when it comes to the aid environment. I mean, as you said, I think in your testimony to the SFRC, like, we had a government that was completely aid dependent. So we couldn't use aid as leverage, because if we turned off the aid, the state fell apart. And so we just flooded the country with aid. And of course, that fueled corruption. We had a country that had an extremely small economy, and then, relatively speaking, overnight was just inundated with foreign money. And of course, that would probably make any society corrupt, and any government corrupt. And now we see the pendulum swinging to the other extreme. I mean, is there a middle path available to policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to acknowledge for Western policymakers that there was complicity in creating Afghan aid dependence. It was, the US, other donors were not giving those exceptional amounts of aid to Afghanistan simply out of altruism. It was because it was giving aid in support of Western policies and Western interests, and trying to create a system and a government in Afghanistan that would be aligned with Western interests, and in particular, Western security interests. And that's why the money was put into Afghanistan. I mean, the US did not invade Afghanistan to free the women of Afghanistan, to help the people of Afghanistan. It invaded to advance its own interests. And that those interests are what supported the continuation of aid over the years, even though there was a considerable diminishment in the levels of aid by the end, and an effort to try to put it on a more sustainable path, but it was still fairly significant numbers. So that's not to say that there wasn't plenty of Afghan government complicity in what was done with the aid, what wasn't done with the aid, the corruption, and the failure to take steps that would have helped make the system more self-sustaining. But it's just to say it was a two-way street in creating the aid dependency. And it's because of that very high level of aid dependency, with 3/4 of public expenditures funded by donors, that turning off that spigot caused an abrupt and enormous economic shock. And so whether you think it's warranted or not, I mean, taking a value judgment out of it, it's just simply an objective fact that turning off the spigot caused the enormous economic shock that is leading to the severe distress among the Afghan population now. So, I think it's, that's not to say that it should all be turned back on and that you should simply return to an unsustainable situation of aid dependency. But it is to say that an easing of the restrictions and a glide path to a lower level of international support would be a much more humane approach than this abrupt turning off of the spigot that we've seen happen.
And we've had a question in the chat, which is, why can't China sort of fill in the vacuum here and provide some of these services? And it's interesting because China has offered so little funding to Afghanistan. And I think the Chinese position is pretty clear. They care about militant groups that might affect their security, but they have very little interest in engaging in any kind of nation building in Afghanistan. And I think you said, it was your words, in your testimony, you said there's this "you broke it, you fix it" attitude from the region in terms of who's responsible for Afghanistan. I mean, ironically, we've seen that messaging from Pakistan, even though Pakistan has a decent amount of responsibility for where Afghanistan is today. We've seen that from China, from Russia, from other regions. Do you think those regional countries are deluding themselves in terms of what the consequences will be for them if Afghanistan fails as a state?
No, I think they're worried about it. And, you might be tempted to think, one might be tempted to think that the Chinese are playing chicken here, that they're just like, well, they're not going to jump forward and provide aid. They're going to wait and see until others do. Maybe, but the fact is, it's not a normal practice for Beijing to be giving the kind of grant aid and development aid that has been provided to Afghanistan and that helped to keep the last government afloat. And I mean, it is interesting that even the humanitarian aid provided by Beijing is just a tiny drop in the bucket. So I think, it would be certainly at Afghans' peril, if not at the peril of American and other Western interests, to try to, play chicken with Beijing in reverse and say, well, we're just not doing anything until we see whether, you who are closer to the region and are concerned about stability step up first. The situation is just deteriorating too fast to be able to try to make those kind of calculations. And when, there just isn't going to be a sufficient amount of transparency from Beijing about their policy decisions on this to be able to be confident that stepping back means that they will step forward.
Another question from the chat, which I think is important, is what exactly does the United States want from the Taliban? Because even I'm a little bit confused as to what the Biden administration wants. We know that there's the secret annexes of the US Taliban agreement that haven't been made public. We know that one of those annexes dealt with the timeline of the withdrawal, and I suppose that's somewhat irrelevant at this point, except for maybe historians and people conducting after actions for policy. But the other annex, which is still very much relevant, is this counterterrorism cooperation. And people have suggested that the reason it's secret is because the Taliban is afraid to have that information public, lest it be used by competing groups like Islamic State to say, well, look, you're collaborating with the invaders, and therefore we have more legitimacy than you. But others say it should be made public because it's important for us to understand what exactly we want from the Taliban. So what does the Biden administration want from the Taliban?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's too productive to speculate about the secret annexes because we don't really know what's in them. My best guess on that is that if and when they are revealed, we'll all say, that's it, that's all that was in there. I just suspect that the more sensitive parts at the time it was signed were things having to do with the withdrawal process, and that there's not really some kind of significantly meaningful assurances or promises from the Taliban in there. I could be wrong, but that's my educated guess about the annexes. I am not sure what the Biden administration wants from the Taliban now that they also think they might get. I am not sure that they're sure yet what they want. I think this is a policy that is still in formulation, because it's one thing to sort of want things in the abstract. I want the Taliban to be less Taliban. I am not going to get the Taliban to be less Taliban. So what can you get that is practical, pragmatic, realistic, that you could imagine in some kind of give and take? The difficulty with what you might want from them, if you're an American policymaker on counterterrorism, is that it's very hard to imagine things that you could get from them that are very concrete and near term and provable in terms of their actions and revealable publicly. Because even if there is some cooperation on counterterrorism, I don't think that the Taliban would want that to be out in the open. I also am skeptical that the United States would really be prepared, that the military and intelligence agencies of the United States would really be prepared to engage in practical cooperation that would involve sharing of information. I just think we're pretty far away from that level of trust. So if, for instance, you wanted to set some sort of test for the Taliban, like what would it be? Is the United States going to get some really useful piece of intelligence information for targeting that it's then going to share with the Taliban? Like maybe, but I don't know. I find that very hard to see. And so how do you really set a test that is that proves that they're following through on kind of preventive actions? I mean, what they promised to do in the Doha deal is not go after al-Qaeda, is not take out, detain, kill, capture, expel terrorist leaders and dismantle groups. They promised to just keep a lid on things. So how do you prove that you're keeping a lid on things? Is it just like, well, there hasn't been a terrorist attack? There's no terrorist training camp that we can see. It's very difficult. So, it's not to say there couldn't be some kind of ongoing conversation about counterterrorism, but as a specific ask that you can then specifically say, okay, we've, got something to work with here. It's difficult. And, even on inclusion, like, what does that mean? Like, you're going to get 3 more minorities in the government, and therefore you've checked the inclusion box, and even though they're not going to be empowered to do anything, like, I don't know what the specific ask is on that. Girls schooling, that's a very specific thing. I think that's where one of the few things where I think you can be super clear about what you want, but also, as Shahrazad has mentioned, as Jan mentioned, to be realistic about it, that's going to be an ongoing, persistent negotiation. It's not going to be an all at once, they announce one day, all girls schools have opened everywhere in the country.
Well, I think maybe we have a potential topic for a next panel. we're at time, but I think this is important enough that I'm going to make a decision to go 1 or 2 minutes over. And Shahrazad, I want to give you the last word. We have an international community that seems more concerned about its reputational costs than the people of Afghanistan. We have a US administration that's not sure exactly what it wants. And we have a country that is weeks or if not days away from starvation, and where universal poverty is a real possibility. So Shahrazad, what is at risk for Afghans, especially women and girls, if the international community does not get liquidity into the economy, does not figure out a way to administer aid, and does not prevent this economic crisis from unfolding? And then what other message, any message, do you have for the international community as an Afghan woman who also has a deep policy and academic knowledge of the country?
Thank you, Adam. Let me add one more actor to the actors that you mentioned, and that's Taliban. There's also, of course, huge risk for Taliban in this scenario. If they don't start trying to get their minds together and create a consensus around some important issues that are simple to resolve, like girls' schools, it's unlikely that it would be easy for people advocating for aid, for development aid, for all these things that we are saying, to have much progress with the Western nations. So it's also on them to actually try to shift from the insurgency mindset to governance mindset and say, look, these are some really easy wins. There's nothing in Islam and there's nothing in Afghan culture against education of women. It's actually as overwhelming a demand in Afghanistan as ceasefire was, which also Taliban stubbornly stood against, and look where that brought us, and themselves in the country. So when millions of Afghans are fleeing them, millions of Afghans, men and women, are fleeing them every day, it's also on them to get together, sit in a room and say, guys, we have to fix this. We can't let a few of you who thinks for some strange reason that's neither religious nor moral, nor ethical, no ground whatsoever, to be stubborn and keep schoolgirls, girls closed in Kandahar and hope that the world will actually give in to our stubbornness one day. So I think that one main actor, we talked a lot about state collapse. How do you define Afghanistan right now? Isn't it already a state collapse? I mean, there is no proper delivery of justice. I asked my colleagues yesterday, in most places, courts are not functioning. Order is maintained in a very brutal way. People are not being paid salaries. Like teachers, healthcare workers are not being paid salaries. People are starving. This is state collapse. And this will lead to more insecurity, more people joining IS, and more problems for Taliban as well. It's not going to just be problems for the neighboring countries, for Europe, for the US. It's going to be actual problems for Taliban to deal with if they continue to be non-inclusive, stay in their small circles, stop girls from going to school, tell Afghan women they have no future in the country. I don't think any amount of humanitarian aid can help them sustain their government as a government. Now, message to international community is, let's get our priorities straight, right? I mean, meeting the pledge, the humanitarian pledge, that should have been done 2 months ago. Why are we still talking about this? I'm amazed. Why are we still talking about this? We have so much money to spend on war. We don't have enough money to spend on saving lives. Come on, people. And finding solutions, okay, maybe unfreezing of assets is too much of a political cost. And I'm not a technical expert, but I'm also reading that can't be a solution for everything. It's not some magic trick. There are other ways, and we can think about a spectrum of solutions together. Who is working on those solutions? If people are not working on those solutions, why aren't they working on those solutions? Is this because they just don't like the Taliban and so they're not gonna let Afghans starve? They're gonna let ordinary people think, if they were not Afghans, if they were your neighbors, people living around you, your community, your family. My uncle is a teacher. He hasn't been paid salaries for 3 months. How is that gonna make you feel? So we have to sort this out. It's our shared responsibility. Afghanistan is not where it is just because ordinary Afghans messed up. It's because my government messed up. It's because the American government messed up. It's because many different governments messed up. Pakistani government messed up, and Taliban messed up. And now the ordinary Afghans should not have to pay the price.
Well, indeed. And I think the Taliban need to decide whether they want to remain in insurgency or act as a government. And the international community needs to decide whether it believes in humanitarian aid and human rights for Afghans, or whether those were just talking points that they used to cover up what was a brutal war. I want to thank all of you for joining. Jan unfortunately had to leave, but this has been a very insightful panel. As usual, I'm left wishing we had 2 or 3 hours to discuss this. I encourage everyone to follow the writing and the work of the panelists. And Shahrazad, you recently had a very interesting podcast in BBC's podcast, people that looks into your life and your evolution as a thinker and an Afghan woman. That's quite interesting. And Laurel, your testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was very insightful yesterday. I encourage people to go back and listen to it, or at a minimum to read your written testimony. The Quincy Institute recently led a letter that was joined by 15 other organizations, veterans groups, religious groups, foreign policy organizations, calling on the Biden administration to continue vigorous aid and diplomacy to Afghanistan, calling for at least a partial unfreezing of the funds, potentially done with an auditor, because without liquidity in the economy, no amount of aid will save it. And I think it's important that policymakers scramble, and I'm going to use that word, scramble, to prevent what is still a preventable crisis. And I really hope that 6 months from now, we are not having another panel in which we have to discuss what went wrong that led to the starvation of millions of Afghans, because this is a predictable disaster. And with that, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I'd like to thank the listeners.